Well, first I'd like to apologize that I will not speak in Russian. The plan was that I would come a day earlier and I'll have 24 hours to catch the language, but I just fell asleep after the long flight, so I'll have to stick to English, and my apologies. So the second point, before I begin, I'd like to thank Professor Kovelman and the museum who invited me to come over, and that not only brought me here, but also assigned me a wonderful translator who's sitting with me and was able to, so I would be able to learn and hear all the wonderful lectures that have been here. So with that, without further ado, let me go into my topic. Symbols and symbolic language prominently feature in human experience from its earliest, most rudimentary stages. Even before people knew how to write and read, they expressed themselves in drawing and art, and those are full with symbolism, whether a snake, a female's body, or a rising mountain. Physical elements acquire additional levels of meaning and function as expressions of the ideals, challenges, and anxieties that permeate our lives from the earliest times to this very day. But in this conference, there is no point in elaborating on that. That is the basis for what everyone here is doing. However, scholars of symbolism apply a variety of tools to decipher the meaning of their objects of research, which are symbols, from semantics and semiotics to psychoanalysis, philosophy, and anthropology. I have very little competence in any of these fields, which begs the question, what am I even doing here? I'm a scholar of texts. That is, I'm a philologist of both Jewish, rabbinic, and Greco-Roman literatures. And I'm also an archaeologist, and I try to combine the two. I study physical artifacts and the way they register in people's consciousness. So here's the connection. The physical, tangible dimension of symbols is quite often neglected or at least relegated to the sidelines. Scholars of symbolism are attracted to the more abstract aspects of the symbol, perhaps justifiably so, to its spiritual meaning, to the ideas and concepts that a symbol represents. But all symbols, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, have their root in a concrete, corporal object, something that you can touch and feel, a three-dimensional artifact that then acquires meaning beyond its physical dimension. A cloud that we've heard about before, it represents light and represents grace, as the lecturer has presented, but at first, it's just a cloud. And so forth regarding any symbol. And therefore, to me, what the basic definition of a symbol is a physical artifact that acquires meaning beyond its physical dimension. So I turn my attention in my own work to the bodily aspect of spiritual symbols. And I ask in a variety of studies, and I'll ask here today again, what and how does this physical dimension, the real, contribute to the creation of symbols? How does the real world function within the abstract notion of symbolism? And I'll give you one example to discuss here, sort of a short test case regarding an area that I've studied for a while, which is the Temple Mount in the city of Jerusalem. So everyone knows this picture, which is very, very famous, not only to people who study the past, but also to people who know and discuss the present. This is the old city of Jerusalem. seen many times. And within that city, many things could be discussed, in some ironic or some joke of history. History brought into one squeezed place of about 500 meters on 500 meters, three of the most sacred, meaningful places in all three traditions. And then everyone is surprised that people have been killing each other about it for so long. Why did it have to all be in one city? There's so many cities in the world, you could spread them out. No, but in one city we have all that. But in today's lecture, I'd like to concentrate on the so-called Temple Mount. So you see the Temple Mount all the way in the back of the old city. That square that has that dome, the golden dome, the Kubat al-Sahara in Arabic, the Dome of the Rock in English. That dome stands, as you can see in the picture, at the center of a big compound known as the Temple Mount. Haram al-Sharif in Arabic, Temple Mount in English, Har Habayit in Hebrew. So the English is almost an exact translation of the Hebrew. Now, I don't need to make an argument because that's self-evident. Everyone understands that the term Temple Mount, this place that you see on the map there, that compound, trapezoid compound at the back of the picture, is a symbol. In our world today, as hundreds of years before, when people say the Temple Mount, they don't only refer to that place, they refer to the concepts and to the image that is registered in their mind associated with that place. It is not only a religious symbol, because the house, temple, you hear the word temple there, which is a religious institution. In the Hebrew, it just says the house, the mountain of the house, Har Habayit. But the house is the house of God. So we have a religious symbol associated with this place. But over the years, it acquired also national and even military and ethnic symbolism, a whole range of symbols, not only for Jews, but for Christians and Muslims as well, is associated with that place. And just one example, after the war in June of 1967, when the Israeli general who came with the parachute units who conquered the old city from the Jordanians at the time, when he arrived to that space, he went on the radio and sent the word to his commanders. This is a non-religious, secular general in the middle of the war, and his words were, Har Habayit Beyadenu, the Temple Mount is in our hands. So you see the symbolism resonating within his own words. So we have a place and we have a symbol, and we want to ask, in the few minutes that we have here, what is the connection between the two? That's the place in a close-up. As you can see, a compound that is 488 meters on the west, which is the far line. We're looking at it here from the east to the west. So the west at the top, 488 meters, and 470 on the east, the line at the bottom of the picture, and 315 on the north, and 280. So it's sort of a trapezoid. That's the Temple Mount. Now, it so happens, devoted 10 years of my life to study the history of the Temple Mount, and it resulted in this book, which came out in two editions, one in 2005 and the other one in 2008, called God's Mountain. So I was planning to summarize the entire book for you here today, but that would be only if I'd spoken Russian. Since I couldn't learn Russian in one day, I'm not going to summarize the entire book. But I'll give you 3 points that emerge from that research that I think have effect to the issue of symbolism. One is there is no Temple Mount in real life. What we call the Temple Mount today, Har Habayit in Hebrew, is actually a man-made architectural structure. What you have in the back there in the slide is a modern archaeological reconstruction of Jerusalem as it looked in the Second Temple period. And right there. And as you can see in the back of the picture, there's a big compound with a structure in the middle. That's the temple that existed there for some 500 or so years. And a king by the name of Herod, who many of you know, in the first century before the Common Era, he had a lot of money and a lot of ambition, and he decided to build a structure, a flat structure, not a mountain, never called it a mountain, a flat structure to accommodate the building in the middle and to accommodate the millions of people who would visit this over the years, about between 250,000 to 800,000 people every year, according to some modern statistics that have been quite well proven. So what he did, he used Roman technology and architecture techniques of his time and created a compound. What you see in this diagram is the retaining walls. He built retaining walls around a relatively humble and small slope that goes down there in the hills around Jerusalem. So he built the gray walls all around, retaining walls, and then the retaining walls created a void inside. So underneath the retaining walls, he built arches, and on top of the arches, he put these flat stones. What came out was this podium. It's a podium, or we would call a compound in English, or sometimes an enclosure. At the time of Herod, in Greek, it was called a temenos. A temenos is a flat enclosure that supports an important building in between. So that's the first point. It's a man-made architecture enclosure. The second point is that it could not in any way be categorized as a mountain, because in the area of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is a hilly region, so there are mountains all around, but within the topography of Jerusalem, this place is one of the lowest places. So it's not registered as a high hill or a mountain that rises above the topography. It's actually some place that is very low. Let me give you one slide that would show this. So this is a modern one-to-one reconstruction of a Second Temple Jerusalem that exists today at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Very highly recommended to go and visit if you're around. But the reason I brought this is we're looking at it right now from the east. And if you take a look and just look straight at this compound that was created by Herod, you can see that the areas to the left with the red roof, not that big red roof on the side, that's a basilica part of the compound, but go beyond it to the hill on the other side with the red roofs, or to go to the hill to the right, you see that those two hills are higher than the so-called Temple Mount. That is where is today the Armenian quarter and the church and the Christian quarter of the old city, and topographically they are higher. So if you live in Jerusalem in the time of Herod, you would not see the so-called Temple Mount as the high place that lends to the image of a mountain. Point 3. Not only that it was not a mountain, it was man-made. Not only that it was not high within the topography of Jerusalem, but also no one at the time viewed it as a Temple Mount. And this is something very important that I've studied in great detail and wrote about in the book. When you collect hundreds of pieces of text, because this is a very well documented ancient period, we have many, many texts of all sorts of kinds, texts which reflect people's mind and people's terminology, the taxonomy of the time, never refer to the place as the Temple Mount, not in Hebrew, not in Aramaic, not in Greek, and not in Latin. You'd ask, how do they refer to it? And the answer is, they don't. Because at the time, the most important institution in the area was the institution in the middle. That temple to the God of Israel, where sacrifices were brought on a daily basis and prayers and the high priest practiced, that was the central religious institution for the people at the time. The area around it lacked significance. I mean, it was important in the sense that it was associated with the temple, of course, but it did not have any individual sense of importance. The city did. The city of Jerusalem was an important city. The temple was very important. But between the two, there was nothing else in the conceptual spectrum of the people. So after these points, you ask yourself, so when did the image of the Temple Mount and when did the conceptual category, the Temple Mount that continues till this very day to inflame hostilities and bloodshed and conflict in the Middle East, when did that come to be? Well, the earliest evidence that we have for the concept of the Temple Mount is in the days when there was no temple. That is, this institution, this temple, was destroyed by the Romans in the so-called Great Revolt of the Jews against the Romans in the year 70 CE. Was destroyed by a Roman dynasty by the name of the Flavians, which later on did not allow the Jews to rebuild their temple as they did in all other places in the world. It was very unique. But they, for various internal political reasons in the Roman Empire, that temple in Jerusalem was never rebuilt. In the centuries after the destruction of the temple, within the framework of the literature that Professor Kovelman discussed before, the Mishnah and the Talmud, especially in the Mishnah, the rabbis have started referring to the place that used to be the place of the temple, which did not exist anymore in their time, and Jews did not even live in the city of Jerusalem. They started referring to it as the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount, they started giving it dimension, they started looking at it, they started endowing it with conceptual importance, started embedding it in the mind and in the consciousness of people. So that's one group. The second group is even more interesting. So here I'm taking you to Rome, again to a church very near to the church that we've seen before in an earlier lecture. We visited already today the church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. And on the other side, if you go to Santa Maria Maggiore, which is a great church, you go to the other side of the street, there is a smaller church, a humble church, but extremely significant in terms of the art history, because some of the mosaics there are some of the oldest mosaics in Rome ever. This is the church of Santa Pudetiana, just on the other side of the Santa Maria Maggiore. And what you see here, there's a mosaic on all the way at the apse. I'm going to take you a little closer now. Here's a mosaic, and I'm looking at the piece underneath. I'm going to take you a little closer in a second, but you see we're in the apse, and there's a picture of one of the earliest mosaic depictions of Jesus sitting among his disciples in the city of Jerusalem, as agreed by all scholars who've discussed this. Here it is even closer. So Jesus among his disciples, and I'm not interested in him or his disciples now, but in the background. In the background, you see a very realistic, and scholars have studied this, a few, Professor Bianca Cochnel and others who've studied this have come to the conclusion that the artist knew of the architecture of the city of Jerusalem and tried to give some sort of a realistic depiction in his time. This is Byzantine Jerusalem that we're talking about. The Jerusalem built by the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, known as the sacred city of Jerusalem, Hagia Polis, Jerusalem. And what's interesting here is that if you take a look at Jesus and you look right behind him, there is a mountain there. There's a mountain sitting right behind the back of Jesus with a cross on its top. You see it. There's no reason to argue about it. It's right there. That mountain does not exist in Jerusalem. There is no such mountain. Now, what the artist is trying to depict, he's depicting the Golgotha. He's depicting the stone which in Christian tradition at the time, in the Byzantine period, was the place where the crucifixion took place. And there is a certain stone there, but it's not a mountain and it doesn't rise. See, of course, the picture puts it right at the center of Jerusalem. There's an axis between the cross on top of the Golgotha itself, and Jesus. They're all on one line in the middle of everything, which then would go on in the spatial organization of sacred place of Christians throughout the Byzantine period. But the creation of the mountain does not exist in Jerusalem. This is another sacred mountain that exists in Jerusalem. In my book, I claim that it's not another, it's exactly the same mountain. That is, that Christians and Jews in the early Byzantine period, the rabbis in rabbinic literature, in Christianity in a variety of texts, but here in an artistic depiction, one of the most ancient ones in Santa Pudentiana, are in a way, each one trying to steal from the other a mountain and make it their own. And I'll give you just a few examples. Christians and rabbis, associated with this mountain, very similar traditions. For example, Jews said that from the Temple Mount is where God created the world. Christians said that from Golgotha, God created the world. Jews said that on the Temple Mount, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, took place. And the Akedah prefigures the temple, right? It was supposed to be a sacrifice, a human sacrifice, and then God prevented that, and all the other sacrifices took place in the temple. Well, Christians said, no, the Akedah took place on Golgotha, and it prefigures the crucifixion of Jesus. There was one time that we wanted to sacrifice Isaac, that was prevented, but then we sacrificed Jesus, and that saved the world. So these traditions that move in the same two places, in the same area, in the same spatial organization, both fight to move the mountain into the right tradition. But which mountain? The no mountain. There is no mountain. But they both had a mountain in their image. A mountain that didn't exist, and both associated with it real traditions, created a symbol over it, this time a conflicting symbol, and tried to make it their own. There's more to say about the Temple Mount, but since we all want to run to lunch, let me summarize this and tell you where it brings me. So where does all this bring us? For one, it complicates what scholars too often see as a direct line connecting the real and the symbolic. And if a certain situation, as scholars have it, in the physical world, almost automatically is supposed to inspire a symbolic counterpart, right? We know the study of Greek mythological symbols is a great example that comes to mind, where almost every human expression requires a match in the heavens. So there's a direct line. We have something in the real world, and we have a symbol that reflects it. Well, more often than not, definitely in the symbolic world of Jerusalem, symbols reflect not what is there, but what is missing. I'll give you 3 examples in Jerusalem, just mentions them. The heavenly Jerusalem, that great symbol that goes all the way till today. The heavenly Jerusalem represents the Jerusalem that doesn't exist, the Temple Mount as I showed you right now. Or if you want a third example, take that beautiful image of Mount Moriah, a term that everyone has heard, but very few understand. Mount Moriah, Mor, M-O-R, is perfume in ancient Hebrew. Mount Moriah, Yah is the theophoric ending to Mor. Moriah, the mount of God's perfume. Why call that place the mount of God's perfume? Well, the simple reason is because it stinked. It was stinky. It was smelly. The smell was extremely bad in the place. Think about a temple that worships God on a daily basis with sacrifices. right? We're talking about meat sacrifice in the heat of the Middle East with no refrigeration. What was going on there? What was going on with the meat and with the blood and with the flies? It was stinky. But for the people who were worshiping, that stink of their rotting meat was the greatest smell they've ever had. So they called it the Mount of the Perfume, because that smell represented for them the connection with their God of Israel as being enacted. So again, you see the deficiency of smell contributing to creation of a symbol, Mount Moriah, that is a mount to recuperate for that. I call this model that I showed here in a nutshell, I call it the deficiency element in the creation of a symbol. And at other places in the book, I call it the crisis factor. In other words, rather than tell us about what people have, symbols often tell us more about what they lack. Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to ask a twofold question. For sure, you are explaining to your students in Michigan in what sense either, well, Holy Mountain or Holy Temple was holy. And my question is twofold in this following sense. Well, as far as you interpret it for your students, what was this meaning, sense of holiness, as far as that Judaic tradition is available to us? And the second aspect of the same question is, how do you interpret to your students, how do you explain to your students, what was eventual difference between how holiness of this space and holiness of this temple was understood by Christians and by Jews, well, let's say, well, in late Roman time, in early Christian time, or in the medieval Christian time?
Sure. So yeah, a question about holiness, it's not an easy one to answer. You're probably going to have to invite me another time to speak about that.
That's what I wanted to say.
But in a nutshell, I would say that the way I understand holiness in Judaism is not different the way that I understand it in the Greco-Roman world in general. I'm a classicist, so I bring to the study of Judaism the understanding that it wasn't apart, it wasn't set, and it was not different from any other religious traditions that were going on. And you just look around and you can see the term sacrum in the Greco-Roman world was very simple. The etymology of the word was something that is cut, something that is taken out, cut and taken out and raised from the real world and then endowed with some of the spirit of the gods or even given to the gods. That's what the term means. That's what the word that we use today, temple, derives from the Latin word templum, which means exactly that, an area that is cut outside of the real world. And when you look at the etymology of the word kodesh, which is the word that ancient Judaism used for it, the word lekadesh means to cut in its etymology. That's what the word means, to separate. So holiness was exactly that. That is our world that is made out of many mundane and many regular, what we call profane, another ancient term, profanos, right? Things in that area, some elements are taken and risen and taken apart and then associated with the God. So sacred for me is a space, a physical space in the world of people that is taken out of the world of people and connected with the gods. And I think in that, if you look at it from that point of view, there is not a lot of difference between Jews and Christians. There may be difference in nuances, but in terms of the concept of sacred, I think it's pretty much the same. And I think it's pretty much the same if a Jewish high priest would talk to a Roman priest and they would share views about sacred, they would see that they're pretty much looking at the same place. The question is to what God to give it and to what God is to associate it. But the concept in the context of the ancient world was pretty much the same.
One small question. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. What are the sources that allow us to suggest that the mount that we see here is indeed the Temple Mount and not the Golgotha.
And not what?
And not the Golgotha. And not the place where the Constantine Basilica was erected in the 4th century.
Okay, so that's an easy one to answer because I don't even have to answer it because I can tell you that chapter 5 in my book is devoted entirely to that. So I wrote about 40 pages in order to understand the various. And the good thing is we're on good basis to know because there are many sources that talk about it. Some of them eyewitness sources. So say in the days of Constantine, one of our major sources to Constantine was a resident of Palestine, the Bishop of Caesarea, Eusebius, who writes about this, and he visited Jerusalem many times. He knew Jerusalem, and he himself saw the Basilica of Constantine carried out by his mother Helen in Jerusalem in the 4th century taking place. And so there's a variety of sources. I collected all the sources and studied them, I hope, carefully, and came to the conclusion that at least the way Christians identified the Golgotha, they identified it, the Golgotha was a place outside of the second wall of Jerusalem. Pontius Pilate took, after the trial of Jesus, they took Jesus outside of the second wall into the closest hill that was there. And when Helen arrived to Jerusalem, she made an estimate of where that hill should have been. Okay, and at the time there was a pagan colony there called Ilia Capitolina. She thought she found the place and she made it there. But one thing is for sure, it's not the place of the temple. Because remember, when Jesus himself was crucified, the temple was still functioning. So they wouldn't crucify him on the temple itself. They took him outside of the city to accommodate Jewish laws that were the governing laws of the time in the city of Jerusalem. Person cannot be put to death inside the city because the corpse is impure and so forth. So they took him outside of the city. What was outside of the city in the time of the Second Temple was inside the city in the time of Ilia Capitolina, and Helen with her architects made an estimate, and that's where we have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So, to summarize that, is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for sure the place where Jesus was crucified? My answer is we do not know, but we know that it's the best estimate that Helen and her architects made at the time, and they put a lot of thought into this, at least if we believe Eusebius. And for sure we know that that's not the Temple Mount. Okay, so that we know for sure.
I would like to thank you for a really essential presentation, and I have more or less practical questions. So, as I don't know what to think about the works of Enrico Guidoni on the typology of Rome in early period of Middle Age. So it's quite evident situation when sacral topology or sacral geography contradicts and is very distinctive from real geography. It's absolutely normal, but my question is more or less practical. What do you think is the physical origin of Temple Mount? So how do you consider in architectural and urban terms this very huge and very massive Roman infrastructure?
So to answer that, I'll go in very short 3 phases. Again, not trying to replace my book, which I think should be read, but just to summarize some of the things that I say about it. Okay, so this is the slide that would help us. The origin of the place started about 1,000 years before Herod, because on the slopes to the south of the Temple Mount, these slopes right here, on those slopes there was an ancient Canaanite city by the name of Jebus. And that Canaanite city was there because there was a water resource there. That's the only reason. If you live on the central hill of Israel or Palestine, there's no water, very few springs. So everywhere there was a spring, there was a city. There was a spring, the spring exists still this very day, very rich in water, called the Gihon. The Canaanites built a city there. Now, if we believe the biblical stories, which I tend to suspect, but one way or another, that Canaanite city turned into a capital city of a small kingdom that we call the House of David. Okay, whether it was David or not David, it's not our problem right now. But that kingdom was there again because of the water, and nothing had to do with the Temple Mount. Now, when David, or maybe it wasn't David, if we don't believe the Bible, whoever it was, wanted to build a temple to the God of that kingdom, which was called the God of Israel. So they looked for real estate. It's a real estate question. And if you live in Moscow, you know that very well. You need real estate to build buildings. The city was very small. It was centered around the spring. They looked for a place, and the only natural place is to go on top of the slope to the open real estate and to use that real estate. The other option was either to go into the valleys, which is unrealistic, or to start chopping buildings in the city. Everyone would be angry. So they climbed the slope for another 200 feet, and they built a temple there. Now that temple lasted for 500 years, eventually destroyed by the Babylonians. When people came back and wanted to rebuild that temple, they went to the same place. That's all it was. So it was a real estate question related to water that led to the city first near the water and the temple a little bit away from the water. Now, when Herod arrived, that tradition already existed for 1,500 years. That's a lot of time. 1,500 years, there were two temples, consecutive temples standing on that same place. And he wanted to continue. The thing was, he had too much money. One more issue that could be understood in this context. A lot of money to waste and nothing to do with it. So he launches this huge building project. He brings the best architects in the world, the best engineers, and he creates just an artificial compound around the temple. Okay, the temple was already there. He just created the compound around it. And that's what we have today. Now, when you go to Jerusalem today and you look at what we call the Temple Mount, or you go to the top and you visit the Islamic institutions there, they're all built still on Herod's compound. It's the same compound. It's a testimony to the great architects of the Romans. They built stuff, and if you didn't touch them, if you didn't burn them, they would last. And it lasted. It's still a Roman structure that we have today with the same retaining walls and the same flat surface that Herod built. So that's what it is. If you look at now, all the other traditions about the creation of the world or the Akedah and all the religious associations with it, you want to believe it? You could. Yeah, the Islamic religions have different traditions about the place. They can believe them, but at the core, it's a very realistic and human process of architecture, real estate, and water.
May we come back to the previous picture from Santa Pudenzana? Because it's just a short comment. Because to the discussion with Dr. Tchaikovsky, I would like to say that there is no any contradiction from the point of view of early Byzantine iconic imagery. So in this image, there is a fusion of two images. Certainly images of Golgotha. There are some elements, archaeological elements of this. And the most impressive one is the appearance of the throne behind the mountain. We know from Egeria's description that such throne existed on real Golgotha since the 4th century. And at the same time, it could be the image of the Temple Mount. It sounds very logical from the Christian point of view, because they wanted to create the new sacred center and the new Temple Mount at the Holy Sepulchre. So from Byzantine iconic imagery, well, it's no ground for discussion. It could coexist. So thank you very much.
Yeah, so not much to add there, but thank you for this insight, for sure. One point I will mention, and maybe we can continue discussing it later, what comes to mind is another Byzantine image in the map from Madaba, the image of Jerusalem in the map of Madaba, which is pretty much from the same time, from the other side of the Mediterranean, Madaba in Jordan. And in that map, there's also a depiction, a very realistic depiction of Jerusalem with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the middle. But the Temple Mount is not there at all. It's the one element in the map that is not there. And the Temple Mount is the most dominant feature in Jerusalem, right? You saw how it realistically, it's overwhelmingly imposing and big, and it's not in the map. So I'm wondering, and I'd be happy to hear what you think about it. I'm just raising it as a question.
Thank you very much. It's also an interesting point, because in Madaba we have a topographic image, but here we have an icon. So, and there is a difference in approaches. So there are two different kinds of imagery.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much.